Welcome, welcome, everyone, to the first class in a surprise pop-up last-minute addition to Drisha's Autumn's Mon, a new class with Rabbi David Silber, the snake in the garden. We are so happy to see you all here tonight, especially on short notice, and we hope that you will of course, find this to be a good use of this time that you're giving us. So I'd like to give a little introduction. Um, uh, the expulsion from Eden is a foundational narrative of the Bible. At the center of the story is the wily nachash, snake or serpent. These 4 sessions will explore the ways in which this narrative plays out in other biblical texts and what it suggests about human beings and their potential for evil. While many of you, of course, have known Rabbi Silber for quite some time, I would like to introduce him to anyone new to our learning community. Rabbi David Silber is the founder and dean of Drisha Institute for Jewish Education in New York and Israel. Rabbi Silber received ordination from the Rabbi Isaac Elchanan Theological Seminary. He is a recipient of the Covenant Award for Excellence in Innovative Jewish Education and is the author of the Passover Haggadah, Go Forth and Learn, and for such a time as this, Biblical Reflections in the Book of Esther. He is also a nationally acclaimed lecturer on the Bible. We ask that those of you with us here on Zoom, please stay muted unless we are having an open discussion period. And if you would be comfortable joining us on camera, we really appreciate the feeling it lends to our learning community to be able to look around the room and see one another's faces. Feel free to type questions into the chat. If you're joining us on Facebook, post your comments below the video and we'll bring them over here. And to those joining us on Drisha Live, hello. If you have a beloved Tanakh that you prefer to use, you're of course welcome to find sources there as they come up, but I will also be sharing text on screen and in links in the chat for your convenience. Without further ado, Rabbi Silber.
Thank you very much. Okay, so we have 4 sessions, Snake in the Garden, and as Noah said, I wanted to explore both in terms of the initial story, creation, second creation story, one of the foundational stories of the Bible, maybe of Western civilization, and then to look at other biblical texts, some midrashim, maybe a couple of other things, and to raise certain questions that I think are implicitly, perhaps explicitly at points raised by this story. We'll get to those questions. Let me begin with a brief introduction about the snake in the garden. So the snake in the garden, the nachash, snake, serpent, is the, I would say, the main character, the most interesting character that appears in the second creation narrative. The first creation narrative, which is the creation of the world in 6 days and resting on the 7th. There's certainly no mention of nachash there. And beyond that, the first creation narrative presents us with a perfectly ordered world. God creates everything. There are few verbs of action in the first chapter of Genesis. Largely, it seems to be created through God's speech, Vayomer. God speaks, and it is. And Vayihi, it is that way. There seems to be no opposition, and there's no difficulty. It's created through speech, perfectly ordered, very beautifully ordered. The human being seems to be the pinnacle of creation, the capstone of creation. And of course, the capstone of the entire chapter is the holy Shabbat, sacred time. And that's really the first creation narrative. It is true that in that first creation narrative, we are told that God considers creating the human, Naseh Adam, and that God instructs the human. But the instruction in chapter 1 is about what the human may in fact do. It's about the privileges that the human being has. The human being controls the world, and at the very end of the first chapter, the human being is told that she may eat of the fruits of the field and the grass and the herbage, etc. That's the first creation narrative. One of the main words in the first creation narrative is the word tov. Every day is what God does is tov. And at the end of the sixth day, we are told God looked at everything. V'hinei tov ma'od. It is very good. So actually, in a nutshell, those are some of the things that mark the first creation story. Then we come to a second creation narrative, which actually begins here the way the chapters were arranged for some strange reason. It's chapter 2, verse number 4. Eile toldot hashamayim v'aretz v'hibaram v'yom asod Adonai Elohim eretz v'shamayim. So such is the story of heaven and earth when they were created, when Lord God made earth and heaven. And the Torah then sets out to describe this creation, this second story. Some of the details of the second story seem to conflict with the first story. I'm not going to now make any attempt to reconcile the two accounts, but it's a very different story. Whether one, in fact, can or cannot reconcile the two stories is a very good question. But what marks the second story is some of the things that mark the second story, apart from the presence of this nachash, which of course is very important. But apart from that, what's interesting is that there's one human being that's created called Adam. Let's call this one Earthling. And then God says, after having created this human being, God says, Lo tov heyot Adam levado, in verse number, was it 16, I think? 18, verse 18. It's not good that the human is alone. Eselo ezer kenegdo. So right away, in this second creation story, we are struck by two words, which is lo tov, because the whole first chapter is tov, and collectively tov ma'od. But there's something about the second creation that is incomplete. In the words of the Torah, lo tov. And God sets out to rectify what is lo tov. So immediately we feel that we're in a story, a creation story, in which things are not fully completed, fully developed. Maybe they're imperfect. And the other interesting point, in conjunction with the God who creates, both in the first creation story and the second. In the first creation narrative, it's very striking that the key word is vayomer, that God speaks and it is, vayomer. But the second creation story has a different set of verbs. In the second creation narrative, it uses verbs of action. God is planting something. God plants a garden. Vayitashem Elokim gan b'Eden. Vayasem, God places there the human that God had created. Vayatzmach, in verse number 9, God causes to grow from the ground. So vayatzmach is another verb. Vayitzer, God is forming, is another verb. God later in the chapter is walking. Vayikach, God takes, in verse number 15. So the description in the second creation narrative, the God who's being described, one might say the God of the second creation narrative is described, I would say, in very human terms. There are verbs that we identify with the human being, planting and taking and placing, that are very prevalent in the second creation narrative. That's the second point. Number 3, in the second creation narrative, in the first creation narrative, God does everything. But in the second creation narrative, God does not do everything. For example, the naming of the animals in the second creation narrative is done not by God. God brings the animals to Adam to see what Adam would name them. And Adam names all the animals. Having named all the animals, the Torah says Adam recognizes that Adam has no partner. And then God fashions from Adam another person. And once again, we have these same words, vayapel, vayisgar, vayiven, vayiviyeha. God brings this other being to Adam. These are verbs we identify with human action. And once again, Adam names this being. But in naming the being, or calling the being Isha, Adam names himself Ish. the word ish is given by Adam, and actually it's given as Adam as part of the naming of the other. The other is Isha, so Adam names himself. So we have Adam in the second creation story, one might say, if not a full partner with God, certainly a partner, certainly a part of the creation. So therefore, the entire, my point here is that the second creation narrative is presents God to us, if not human, but in human terms. God's creation is incomplete or imperfect. God has a helper in creation. So in this particular context of a different kind of world, a kind of imperfect world, one might say, this is the context in which we find this nachash. We are introduced to the nachash in chapter 3. And actually, we're not even introduced to the nachash in chapter 3. It's stated as a fact that the nachash was hanachash haya arum mikol chayat hasadeh asher asa Adonai Elohim. Now, there's something else interesting. I want to just point this out. I'm hardly the first to point this out, but what many scholars, Bible critics, noticed, and anybody who reads the Chumash notices this, that in the first creation story, God is called Elohim throughout the creation story. Only that name, that's the only name of God in chapter 1, Elohim. But in the second creation story, it's Hashem Elohim. Yud Hey Vav Hey Elohim. And it appears, I once counted them up, either 21 or 28 times. It's the only narrative in the Bible where we have this consistent use of Hashem Elohim. But the Bible critics made a fuss about this and said this demonstrates there are two different texts, two different documents and all that. I'm not going to get into that conversation. But in point of fact, actually, I would argue the opposite, that the fact that it's not Hashem, but Hashem Elohim means something else. It means that the Torah is saying to us, my beloved student, you have read chapter 1 about Elohim, and now I want to tell you the second creation story. Also, Elohim is involved, but it's not just Elohim. It's Hashem Elohim. It's both. The two stories, therefore, these two creation narratives, which are different, they certainly present a different view of the human being. That was Rabbi Soloveitchik's main point of his essay. I would say prior to that, I don't mean temporally prior to that, but before we get to the different conceptions of the human being, I would argue it may even present two different conceptions of God. The God described in chapter 2 and 3 in the second creation story is described very differently from the transcendent and all-powerful God of chapter 1. So these are certainly two different stories, but, and we'll get to this later, they are in conversation with each other. And in this second description of creation, one which one might say is imperfect, it's within this particular setting that we have this nachash, who was not introduced. The first verse of chapter 3, or it's actually verse number 2 here, V'hanachash haya arum mikol chayat hasadeh asher asa Adonai Elohim. Vayomer el ha'isha, av ki amar Elohim lo tofu mikol eitzagan. The nachash was a room, presumably from the context here means was more clever, wily, or clever. Arum, related to the word arma, more clever, more wily, guile. Arma suggests guile, cleverness, maybe sneakiness. But it's presented as a fact. You know the nachash? He was more arum, as if we, the reader, know there is a nachash. It doesn't say God created the nachash. It said the nachash was arum. So we're assuming that the nachash is there. And the only question is the nature of the snake. What is the nature of the snake? Which will be the main point of conversation for this session and the next 3. So where is the snake coming from, actually? So the truth of the matter is that I believe because it singles out the nachash. When you read the first chapter, it sounds like God creates all the animals, and it doesn't single out any particular animal. God creates all the animals. God creates the species. God creates the birds, and God creates the fish, and God creates the animals that roam the earth. There's no mention of a nachash. Having said that, however, the truth of the matter is that the Chumash actually, I believe, does single out the nachash in chapter 1. The nachash is already singled out in chapter 1. True, the Torah didn't call it a nachash. The Torah had a different name for it, but it is the one thing that's singled out in chapter 1. And what is the one thing that's singled out in chapter 1? That's not a species, but a particular animal.
Tanin.
The tanin, of course. And that is on the 5th day. Vayivra Elohim et ha-taninim hagdolim. God created the great taninim. A tanin is typically translated as a serpent. Nachash is also translated as a serpent. And beyond the fact that it's translated in English often the same way, the important point, and maybe we'll get to this, hopefully, is that actually in the Chumash they're used interchangeably. Where in the Chumash are they used interchangeably?
Oh.
So it's interesting that when Moshe, in the second book of the Torah, so Moshe is, God approaches Moshe and instructs Moshe to go back to Egypt and to save the people, take God's people out of Egypt, take your brothers out of Egypt, take Israel out of Egypt. And Moshe gives many reasons that he doesn't want to go. He refuses to go. And one of them is, they're not going to believe me. They'll say God didn't speak to you. And God says to Moshe, Mazeh biyadecha. What are you holding in your hand? Let me just find that verse. If we have to share the screen up or not, but let's find that verse anyway. That's in Exodus, it's the book of Shemot. That's chapter 4, verse number 2. Mazeh biyadecha. What's in your hand? Vayomer mateh, a staff. Moshe is a shepherd. He probably has a shepherd's staff. Vayomer hashlicheu arza. Throw it to the ground. Vayashlicheu arza vayihu nachash. And Moshe throws it to the ground. It becomes a nachash. Vayonos Moshe mipanav. Moshe runs away, frightened. Vayomer Hashem el Moshe shlach yodcha v'echoz biznavo. God says to Moshe, grab onto its tail. Vayishlach yado vayachzek bo vayihu mateh b'kapo. So Moshe grabs onto its tail. That's not usually the best way to pick up a snake, by the way. Pick it up by its head. But okay, grab onto its tail, turns back into a mateh. So Moshe's mateh is also a nachash. It's a mateh, it's a nachash. That's in chapter 4. Later on, Moshe is instructed to go to Paro and to speak to Paro to allow the Jews to be set free. And God instructs Moshe, he says, I made you with Elohim with Paro. Aaron, your brother, is your prophet, chapter 7 of Exodus. Let's see, wait, verse number 8. Vayomer Hashem el Moshe v'el Aaron ki yedaber alechem Paro lemar tlu lachem mofet. Paro will say to you and Aaron, your brother, demonstrate a miracle. Show us a wonder or a sign. When he says this, v'yamarto Paro, v'yamarto Aaron, and instruct your brother Aaron, kachet matcha v'yashlech ufnei Paro yihi l'tanin. Throw down your staff, your mateh, turn it into a tanin. And we are told that Aaron does this, but the wizards, the magicians of Egypt also do this. They do the same thing. And they also turn into taninim. And then the Torah says, and Aaron's staff swallowed their staff. So we have two miracles, two staffs, the staff of Moses, the staff of Aaron. The staff of Moshe, when God speaks to Moshe and instructs Moshe, and Moshe raises the question about Israel, God says, throw down your staff, and it turns into a snake and back into a mateh. When they go to Paro, it's interesting. It sounds like similar story. Once again, a miracle with the mater. Once again, is transformed into something else. This time, the Torah didn't use the word nachash, but it uses the word tanin. It is certainly a suggestion that the tanin and the nachash are similar. The English translation of the two is actually identical, which is serpent. And so it's interesting that the Chumash itself is using, it would appear, nachash and tanin, if not identically the same, they're certainly very similar. They might even be synonyms. So therefore, if this is the case, then it turns out that the taninim that is singled out in chapter 1, taninim agdolim, right? The great serpents that actually the Torah perhaps is setting up. One of the ways in which the Torah is setting up the second creation narrative is by mentioning specifically, singling out. Because the question is, why did the Torah single out the taninim? God creates all the creatures of the deep, and God creates all the birds and all the animals. Why single out the taninim? So it could be because what the Torah is doing is setting up the second story of the nachash. I want to explain that better, but before I explain it better, I just would point out that Kasuto had a different reason. This is all relevant to the state. Nothing, it's only an hour class, and 4 times, everything is relevant. And that is Kasuto's argument, actually, which had a big impact on my life, because I learned this when I was a kid. Somebody brought in on Shabbat and gave a class, and I went to the class, and he was reading from Kasuto's work. And Kasuto got very interested in Kasuto, looking at the pshat of the Chumash. And Kasuto argued, among other things, that the first creation narrative is a response to other stories of the ancient Near East. In the other stories of the ancient Near East, which describe creation, there's always a struggle that takes place at the onset of creation. And in fact, the struggle, there are certain creatures or powers that exist in these other narratives, Numa Elish being one of them, but many of the ancient Near Eastern narratives. There is Tiamat, or in Hebrew the word would be Tahom. There is Yam, which is Yam in Hebrew. Rahav is another one that also appears in the Psalms. And there is Tanin. Tanin. Tanin is one of the great creatures. In the beginning of creation, there's a struggle, and one God overpowers the other. So Kasuto argued that the mention of the Taninim as being created by God is a direct attempt by the Torah to say the following: you who are reading our account of creation are well aware, of course, of all the other accounts of creation in which there's a struggle. But in my account, in the Torah's account, there is no struggle. God created the great sea serpents. God created the birds and the fish and the sea serpents, and to God it's all the same. It's the same thing. Vayomer Elohim, God says, and it is. There is no opposition, there's no struggle. There's one transcendent God, all-powerful, who creates everything. That was Kasuto's point. And then Kasuto had another point, that when you read other parts of the Bible, this other account of creation, the struggle, is hinted at, or perhaps even almost explicit, in other verses of the Bible, in the Psalms, in the book of Iyov, and that's certainly the case. That was Kasuto's point. I remember when I learned this, it had a big impact on me, because he was actually looking at what the Torah seems to say. He wasn't doing it through the commentaries, which I also love, but he was looking at what he would call the plain meaning of the text. Now, I've mentioned this Kasuto many times, and I consider him, even though I never met him or anything, but one of my teachers. I thank him in one of my books. Having said all that, I think it's a little off, actually, in the following way. Here's what I don't like about it. What I don't like about the idea that the Torah is being written primarily as a response to Canaanite myths. And that doesn't appeal to me, actually. So I have no doubt that there's a great deal of truth in what he says, no doubt. But I always prefer to find a meaning internally within our text. So I suggest a different way to look at it, even though I accept much of what Kasuto was saying, and that is what the Torah is actually doing is setting up the second story. the tanin are singled out because the Torah is about to get to the second creation narrative, which in my view, my understanding of the Chumash is the main narrative, as far as we are concerned. As far as we humans are concerned, it's the second narrative, which is much more significant than the first, because the second narrative is much more fully about what it means to be human, what it means to be mortal, sexual, what it means to be limited, what it means to try to relate to one's environment, what it means to try to relate to the other person, and what it means for our purposes to live in a world in which evil exists. And that's the nachash. This is the world in which we live. And God said it straight out, by the way, to the nachash. You are cursed, and you have an eternal battle against the children of this woman. Her children and your children are locked in eternal struggle, which can only mean one thing. Evil is there to stay. The nachash is always around and in many forms. And over the next 3 weeks, I'd like to explore some of the ways that the nachash is present as an external truth, but also as a kind of internal truth. The Hasidic masters were very fond of talking about Amalek as an internal state. And the truth of the matter is, I love the Hasidic masters, but we don't need them for this purpose. The Chumash already suggests it, actually, that evil resides within us, that the nachash is within us, is already, in my view, found in the Pshuto Shel Mikra, in the Chumash itself. Maybe that's where they got it from or not. I can't speak to that, but we'll get to these things later. But this is the nachash in the second creation story, but it's set up by the first creation story. In other words, these are two distinct stories, no doubt. They may even contradict at certain points. Not our problem. But they're not distinct in the sense that one is not speaking to the other. They are in dialogue with the other. The first sets up the second, and I'll come back soon to a way in which the first sets up the second, which is relevant to our topic of the nachash. Before I get to part number 2, which is what is the motive of the snake? What is the snake's motive? What is the snake trying to do over here? Which is the second half of what we'll do this evening. Before I get there, if anybody has any comments, questions, please speak up.
Yeah, you and Kasuto fit together very nicely. If you're going to think of evil as something that's ongoing, you better think about it as being something created by God rather than pre-existent.
Well, not necessarily. We'll get to that. We'll exactly get to that point. We will get to that point, and I'll get to that point, but right now, so hold that in abeyance. Does anybody else want to suggest, speak?
So there's a choice as to how to understand the word mikol. You can understand it as you are, as from all the other, but you can understand it as more than all the. And in this case, you're saying either that the nachash was not created by God, or, as you suggested just now, that the nachash is internal, represents a facet of humankind, in which case this facet of humankind is somehow stronger than all the animals.
Well, I'm not suggesting that in this particular verse, it should be taken in terms of the pshat as an aspect of humankind. I think when it comes to the story over here, and I would say when it comes to myth generally, which is what this is, it's a mythic story. It's a story, but the power of the story is actually that it's a snake. It's not to be understood on the primary level of it. It's a story about a garden and a snake and a man and a woman and a set of trees and one special tree. And that's the power of it, actually. Now, we may interpret it in many different ways, but it's not a kind of allegory. I would call it a myth more than an allegory. We confront it as a story. I certainly didn't suggest that in this verse it means that the snake is part of the human, even though I think that is true. I think that we'll get to that. I think it's a snake. I took mikol to mean more than, actually. For whatever reason, this particular nachash is more clever than all the other animals. And when I say more clever than all the other animals, I would add the following point. So let me just move right into the question of motive. What is
Can I
this?
just ask you one? Can I
Yes.
just ask you one thing? If
Okay.
Adam and Chava have just been described as arumim,
Yes.
and then the nachash is described as arum mikol chayat hasadeh, does that suggest that he has the arumness in common with them and is at the highest level, closest to human beings?
You actually took the
of all
words
the
out of my mouth. I was about to read that pasuk. Actually, I was about to say he's described as arum, and in the previous verse, "Vayushnehem arumim adam v'ishto v'lo yitposhashu." Exactly the point I want to start with, which is what's striking is that the Torah has used the word arum. Now, from the context, it seems to mean two different things. What the connection is between the two is something I've thought about for many, many years. Leave that aside for now. It's pure conjecture. But it would appear to be two different things. The arumim of the previous verse means nakedness. Arum that's what it usually means. Mabish arumim, right? They were both naked, but they felt no shame. They were very innocent. Hadam v'ishto, right? Lo yitboshashu, they are arumim. And the very next words, hanachash haya arum, of course, raises the question what to make of the fact that the Torah has used, okay, it means two different things, but it is a similar, not identical word. What do we make of the identity of the word arum in the two verses, two consecutive verses? So let me say that. Yes.
Can I say something?
Yes.
There's a geometric principle. Things equal to the same thing are equal to each other. So,
Okay.
But by using arum to describe both Adam and Chava and also the snake, they are somehow equivalent of each other. But the thing that I want to focus on is that in creation, everything was created according to minehu. Everything was according to the species. And for the nachash, we don't have anything saying that it was leminehu, that he had no species, he had no mate. And because his species is chayat hasadeh, that's a separate species outside of creation. And so he doesn't have a mate. And so therefore, what triggers his action is that Adam and Chava are arum, they are naked, and he was also within the equivalent of arum, and he is watching them without a min, without having a spouse, which God had just created a spouse for Adam, and he is jealous, and therefore I think that's the trigger for the second story.
Okay, so that's certainly one possibility. One possibility is that what motivates the nachash, I guess we would call it desire of some lust or desire. That is clearly a possibility. Clearly, I think a very valid reading of the word arum in its context, and it's one that actually we have in the Talmud in three different places. And the ones who took this and ran with it all over the place, of course, are the Kabbalistic texts. I refer specifically to the Zohar. The truth of the matter is, and when you're talking about the nachash, it's hard to avoid the Zohar. The Zohar takes this nachash to all kinds of interesting places. I'll make reference to it at some point, but can't get fully into it. But the Gemara, the same Gemara appears in three places. The Gemara makes the claim, actually, that the nachash sleeps with a chava. It's Gemara in three places. Gemara in Shabbat and Avodah Zarah. Appears in another place as well. I'm blocking on the third place, but Yivamot, Kuf Gimel. It's in three places, and Gemara says the same thing. The nachash slept with Chava, and when the nachash sleeps with Chava, he injects in her what the Gemara calls a zuhama, some kind of something putrid, and this stench or whatever zuhama is, really something very negative, resides in all humanity. And the Gemara continues and says, and when the Israelites stood in Har Sinai, and they stood before God in Har Sinai, this zuhama left them. That's all the Gemara says. The Gemara says the Zuamar left them exactly the same, 3 lines in the Gemara. Well, the Zohar takes this thing and runs with it, you can't imagine. And actually, in reading the Zohar, as I was preparing for this class, what struck me about the Zohar, and I've seen this many times, is that the Zohar, leaving out the Kabbalistic, the Sfirot and all that, but what's at the center of it actually is a reading of the Chumash, which I think is actually, in a certain sense, a very good pshat. Well, let's put it this way. It often coincides with what I was thinking about before I even looked at the Zohar in terms of the pshat of the Chumash. Because the Zohar makes the claim, actually, and we'll get to this later in terms of the nachash, the Zohar makes the claim that that was true when Israel stood at Mount Sinai, we lost the Zuamar. But when we made the golden calf, the Zuamar returns. Now, that's actually not in the Talmud. I mean, it may well be a Talmudic midrash as well, but that's the claim that what the Zohar is in effect doing, leaving out all the Kabbalistic sfirot and all that. What the Zohar is claiming actually is interesting, is that the golden calf story is somehow connected to the story of the snake. So I intend to try to explain in the coming weeks that is actually a very important idea of the Chumash. Maybe the Zohar had it in mind, but it takes it to its own interesting directions. But I believe that in the Torah, there's something very profound about that point. But to come to the first point over here about the motive of the nachash, according to this, is desire. And in fact, he actually doesn't just lust after Eve, he actually sleeps with her. And in the Zohar, believe it or not, the nachash, or his counterpart, the devil, Samael, or whatever, actually fathers a child with Eve, and this child is Cain. Cain in the Zohar, I say the Zohar, at least the Zohar that I saw, maybe there are other opinions as well, but is actually the father of Cain. That line of Cain, which doesn't make it past the flood, the father of which is actually the nachash. So talking about the nachash's connection to humanity, the nachash actually is the father of the first child, of the first children, of God's children. But the Cain, the firstborn of Eve, is in the Zohar's way of presenting it, the son of Eve, but the son of the snake. That just gives you a sense of the degree to which the nachash is very central. So that's one possible motive of the snake. It's lust. Torah says lo tachmod, and the snake is a chomed. He's a chomed. I would add that that's one possibility. I would say, having mentioned the Kabbalistic, the Zohar, I would say something else about Zohar. Sometimes I teach with my friend Nathaniel Berman. We've taught together on many occasions. And so I was curious. I saw a copy of his book yesterday. He sent me a copy. And there's all kinds of interesting things there in the Zohar about the nachash. But I would say that for the Zohar, actually, you don't need a motive necessarily. You don't necessarily need a motive at all. Because one way to understand the nachash is, in one word, evil. You don't look for motives. Just as there is the God who manifests in this world in a variety of ways. But as far as we're concerned, the way in which we typically prefer to see God is the God of Rachum v'Chanun, Erech HaPayim v'Rav Chesed, words that suffuse all of our prayers. God's temple is a place where we achieve forgiveness. And God is represented through these, in the Kabbalistic thinking, these various manifestations of God. They call the Sfirot. That's the manifestations of God. But then there's the other side. There's the devil. There's the evil. And that also has its manifestations. So for the Zohar and for other Kabbalistic texts, there are two manifestations. There's the manifestations of God, and then there is evil, which is a reality, wherever it's coming from. That's a good question. Where does it come from? There's all kinds of ideas about where it comes from. But for our purposes, wherever it came from, Maybe it's a very outgrowth of creation itself, but wherever it came from, it is a kind of ontological fact. So the question, what is the motive, would not even be a question. What is the motive of evil? The motive of evil is actually to do evil. And there actually, came across a statement in the Zohar, which talks about the nachash as doing something lishma. And we think of doing mitzvot lishma, but the nachash is on a very high level. The nachash does evil lishma. It does evil for the sake of evil. And if one has that conception of the nachash, of evil, then we don't have to ask what is the motive. The motive is clear. The motive is, there is no motive. That's what the nachash is. And existence contains within it God on one side, and on the other side, they call it the other side, there is this other set of sfirot. Just as there are 10 sfirot manifestations of God, there are 10 sfirot that are manifestations of the called the nachash for our purposes, and so that would obviate the need for any kind of motive.
But
Yes.
Rabbi Silber, if we go back to the nachash as being part of this unique species, Chayat Hasadeh, and if you look where else Chayat Hasadeh is mentioned, it's mentioned where the klalot are, where if you do good, you'll get a bracha, and if you do bad, the way that God punishes the evildoers and punishes us all for not doing the commandment is by he sends the Chayat Hasadeh. That's his tool of punishment for Bnei Israel when they don't listen. So if in this concept of evil, he's the tool of punishment, the tool of evil of God.
Okay, that's a separate point. That may be a very good
I'm
point.
trying to say using to support the point of the nachash being evil. He's not just evil per se, but he's also the tool of God to punish for evildoers.
Okay, but that's right. That may be that's a good point, and we'll get to that later on, because we have a story in the Torah where the nachash is a tool of God to punish, and we'll get to that story. Nachash hanachoshet. That's a very puzzling story. The nachash hanachoshet, God sends the nachash to punish Israel. So there you have the nachash as a messenger, as a tool. But the point I'm making, which emerges from pieces of Kabbalistic writings, is it's not about a tool. It's about, I mean, that's the question. Is this evil empire under God's control, or is the evil empire actually have a kind of autonomous and independent power? It is true that, say, the Ramban, for example, who was a great Kabbalist, but a conservative one, he sees as God controlling everything, including the evil, but God gives the evil permission to act. More radical thinkers may think that it's not about God giving permission, but as God says, it's a war between God and this Amalek Nachash evil until the end of days, in which God will be victorious. But that's a different question. But anyway, we have one possibility is you don't need a motive. One possibility for the snake is it's about desire, lust or desire. That's the second possibility. And then there's a third possibility. I say all this by way of introducing us to other texts about the nachash, but this is very basic. And there's a third way, I think, to understand what drives this nachash. Of course, when we say what drives the nachash, it's a small step to say what drives humans. Human beings are known to desire and to lust. Human beings are known, some people perhaps, maybe people to do evil for evil's sake, hopefully not too many. But then there's another possibility in the story, one that I like very much. I think it's very much the pshat. And that is from what the nachash says in the beginning of chapter 3, when the nachash speaks to the woman. And the nachash says the following, Vayomer ha'isha, chapter 3, verse number 2. And the nachash says, Af ki amar Elohim, lo tochu mikol eitz hagan. Did God actually say you can't eat any of the fruit of the garden? I heard that God said you can't have any fruit whatsoever. And the woman says, Vatomer ha'isha ha'nachash, mi pri eitz hagan nochel. No, we are permitted to eat the fruit of the garden. Umipriya eitz asher betoch hagan, but from the fruit that's in the middle of the garden. Amar Elohim lo tochu mimenu lo tigu bo. Then God said, don't eat or don't touch it or damage it perhaps, lest you die. At which point the nachash says, you're not going to die. Lo mo timutun. It's not about that. It's not that you're going to die, but rather God has a different reason. God doesn't want you to eat this particular fruit because then your eyes will be open. You will be like God's, knowing good and evil. So what interested me a while ago is how the nachash starts the conversation. Nachash says, I heard you can't eat any of the fruit. And what struck me was that actually when you go back to chapter 1 and you read the end of chapter 1 is the perfect creation in 6 days and God resting on the 7th. When you get to the 6th day, it starts with creation of the animals. And then it says on the 6th day, God said, let us create Naseh Adam, B'Tsalmeinu Kidmutenu, in our own likeness, image, etc. And this being will be master of the control of the world. And God created the human being in God's image, male and female, and God blessed the human being. That's where I would have ended the story, me. But the Chumash does not end it there. Strange, because that's the climax, the human being, God's image, controlling the world, majestic man, as Rabbi Soloveitchik called it. That's what I would have ended with, majestic man. But the Chumash doesn't end with majestic man. The Chumash adds 2 more verses at the end of chapter 1. Very strange. The next to last verse is, Hinei natati lachem et kol esev zorei hazera. God said, I have given you all of the grass, all that grows upon the earth, seed-bearing plants that grow upon the earth, and all of the fruit of the trees which you plant shall be for you to eat. And the last verse of chapter 1, but to all the animals, and those that roam the earth and birds, that have in them breath of life, I give them that which grows, the green plants for food. It was so. God saw all that God had done. It was very good. Evening and morning, the 6th day. It's very strange. My Chumash is better, no? Ends with a high note. The Torah doesn't end. So I would have ended it. Tzelem Elohim. The Torah decided, no. The Torah, in its infinite wisdom, said, that's not where you end the story. Why? Why with the anticlimax? And of course, the answer is, that's what got me thinking many years ago. Such a simple question, you know? But of course, the answer is very simple, which is this. The last 2 verses of chapter 1 are the preface to chapter 2. Because what does it say at the end of chapter 1? As far as you humans are concerned, you can have the plants and the fruit. But as far as the animals are concerned, only the plants. Kol chayata aretz, right? Plants and no fruit. And that's what bothers the snake. The snake says, why am I deprived of the fruit? What's so special about them? They're arumim and I'm arum. In fact, they're arumim naked, but I'm arum. I'm the most clever. I'm even more clever than they are. I'm even more clever than they. So that he starts off, I heard that Elohim said you can't have any fruit. Who's he talking about? Of course, himself. And by the way, here's something very interesting about that verse. Throughout the entire second creation story, which interests us, the story of the snake, the name of God throughout the story, 21 times, Hashem Elohim, consistently, from beginning to end. Vayomer Hashem Elohim, Heinu Adam Ya'akaf, at the very end, the very big throughout, with one exception. There's one place in the second creation story where the Torah does not say Hashem Elohim, where the Torah uses only the word Elohim and not Hashem Elohim. And that's when the snake speaks. I heard that Elohim said you can't have any fruit. It's not Hashem Elohim. Because what the snake is actually doing, what the Torah is doing, is referencing the first creation narrative. It's Elohim did say in the first creation narrative, you can't have any fruit. Snake, he said, you can't have any fruit. We can have it. And that's what irritates the snake. God builds this special place, because the second creation narrative is about a special place, not any old place, but a special place. The two creation narratives, not seen as excluding one the other. One builds on the other. There's creation of everything, and within that everything, there's a special place. And in that special place, God has placed the human being, not the snake. Snake's also there. God took the human and God placed the human there. And God walks about the garden. So there can be a constant interaction, perhaps even a dialogue between God and the human. And that's what burns up the snake. And if this reading is correct, I personally like it very much. Then fundamentally, it's not about desire. Desire is about desiring the other person. But what motivates the nachash is something very different. It's not anger primarily against the human. It is anger against the human as the beneficiary of God's largesse. But the real anger is against God. And therefore, the snake sets out to disrupt God's plan. And here we have a very important point about the snake. I mean, what is God's plan? God's plan in creation was to set up a special place where the human being and God can actually interact. That was the ultimate purpose of creation as the Torah describes it, called the Garden of Eden. Later on, the Torah has other names for it. One is the Mishkan. One is Hara Moriah. One is the Mikdash. These are places where God and the human can dwell together. After we're banished from Eden, there's a search for this alternative to Eden. Maybe the land of Canaan is a place where God speaks. But the snake sets out to disrupt God's plan. God's plan is to dwell together with the human, and the snake, who's angry at God, has determined to fight God, to defeat God in battle. And you defeat God in battle by attacking God at God's weak point. Everybody's got a weak point, including God. God's weak point in the biblical narrative is, of course, that which has been created in God's image, namely the human. So God, the snake will attack God at God's vulnerable point. And the vulnerable point is the human being. And here we come back to the introduction to these 4 sessions. And I pointed out that the snake is actually found in chapter 1. Not the word nachash, but the word tanin. Vayivra Elohim et hataninim hagdolim. And Kasuto's point is well taken, namely, that when God creates the taninim, there's no effort. There's no struggle. Says the Torah, you want struggle? Read the Enuma Elish. Read the old Sumerian text or whatever. But in our text, there's no struggle. God speaks and they're created. So you can't defeat God. If you're going to go into battle against God, God is stronger. God just speaks. So how can the snake hope to defeat God? And the answer is you can't defeat God with strength, but you can defeat God a different way with armor, with cleverness, with guile. And that's what the snake is doing. So the intended enemy is God. The target is God. But in order to get at God, you go through God's weak point, which is the human. Now, the reason I emphasize, and of course, if we have a scoreboard after the battle, snake versus God, you have a big scoreboard. Here's the score. Snake won, God nothing. This is a very important point. The snake wins. You can curse the snake all you want. But at the end of the day, God's little plan of the Garden of Eden has been disrupted by the snake. Assuming that was God's plan from the beginning. That's a good question. But if it was God's plan, and the Chumash represented as such, well, at the end of chapter 3, Vayigaresh et ha'adam. The human being has been banished forever from Eden, never to return. So God's plan to set up a special place where God and the human can in fact interact, well, the nachash has defeated God's plan. And that's what the nachash is about. So it's about anger directed at God. And if you think about that, if you read it this way, then actually it's not that different from the very next story in the Torah. This is chapter 3. What is chapter 4? Cain and Hevel. It's exactly this, right? They're two people, and one feels that God has favored the other. And why should God favor the other guy? I'm the
Rabbi
one who had
Silber.
the idea to bring the sacrifice. It was Cain's idea. Hevel also brought a sacrifice. Why is God favoring the other? So the anger. So the anger is directed against the God who favors, but you can't kill God. So we'll kill his brother. But the anger actually is directed and so forth. In the book of Genesis, there are sibling rivalries, often with deadly consequences or near deadly consequences. There's this Cain and Hevel, there's Esav and Yaakov, there's Yosef and his brothers. And in each case, it's about the father favoring one of them or God favoring one of them. So when you read it this way, chapter 3, it fits in perfectly with the continuation, namely the story of Cain and Hevel. Yes, you can't defeat God with a frontal attack. The tiny mean can't defeat God, but you can defeat God in a different way. And let me just say one last point before I take comments and questions. We're going to stop exactly 8:30. And that is that the nachash is important to us, of course, for many reasons. It's the evil that as external to us. It's the evil within us. But in particular, there is a particular set of people whom we identify as the nachash. There are all kinds of parallels to the nachash, and this will be one of the 4 sessions. And of course, that is Amalek. And the point I want to make about Amalek and the nachash, I can demonstrate the parallels, is that actually when you think about it, the nachash in the story in Genesis, the nachash, first of all, the nachash attacks you at the weakest point. He attacks you with the heel. And in point of fact, he actually speaks to the woman and not to her husband. He speaks to the Isha and not the Ish, for the simple reason, not because the women are weaker. There's no evidence in Genesis that the women are weak in the book of Genesis, none whatsoever. But here's the point. She was never commanded not to eat in the first place. He was commanded, don't eat. She was never commanded. She knows of the command, yes, but she was never directly commanded. So there's a better chance you can convince her to eat. That's one point. But the snake will bite you. God's curse of the snake. You dwell in the dust. Humanity will smash your head. You will bite them at the heel. The heel is the weakest point. It's on the bottom and it's below you. And what's interesting is that's exactly Amalek of the Bible. Amalek attacks you at the weakest point. Amalek always tries to take advantage of your vulnerabilities. And Amalek is the only one in the Bible that the Torah describes primarily not as Israel's enemy, but primarily as God's enemy. There is a war against Amalek, God's war in every generation. So it's the story of the nachash. The nachash is primarily, in this reading, God's enemy, also the enemy of the human, of all humanity. Amalek is very interesting because Amalek is also Esau's grandson. Amalek is primarily God's enemy, probably the enemy of all humanity. We'll talk about that next time, but especially Israel, who is seen as God's favored ones, God's chosen ones, the ones that God delivered from Mitzrayim, on the way to Sinai, on the way to the Mishkan, to build God's home, to dwell with God. Vayavo Amalek. It's exactly when Amalek comes. So to summarize what we have, and I'll take a couple of comments, questions. So 2 things. First of all, we located the story of Nachash within the second creation narrative, and we distinguished the second creation narrative, its description of existence, as being quite different from the description in chapter 1, both in terms of the imperfection of the world, also in terms of God. The God in the second creation narrative is presented in very human terms, walking in the garden, calling out to Adam, where are you? Planting, causing to grow, all those verbs. And the world is lo tov. It's not a perfect world. And the human participates in the world. And then I raised 3 possibilities about what the motive of the snake might be. One is there is no need for a motive. The snake is evil. There's no need to find motives. He does it lishma. And then we suggested two possibilities, not mutually exclusive. One is lust or desire, the arumim and the arum, and the Zohar and the Gemara in Shabbat. She sleeps with Eve according to this. And then my suggestion that fundamentally what's driving the nachash is anger at being overlooked. Why is, why are they any better than me? I'm as good as they are. I'm even more bright than they are. I'm even more clever than they are. I know more than they do. I can even fool them. I'll show how smart I am. But there, the anger would be directed primarily against God and incidentally or secondarily against the human. This is a beginning of these 4 sessions. What I wanted to cover is, in the 4 sessions, among other things, is how the snake plays out. And I did want to raise this question about to what extent one can see the nachash as dwelling within us, as a kind of something which is internal within us, using primarily biblical text to demonstrate, in my view, that is a very valid reading of the nachash. I would say it's both. It's both something that dwells within people, but I do believe the Chumash presents evil not just as dwelling within, but as a kind of reality. The ones who took it very seriously, evil as reality, of course, the Zohar and the Kabbalistic text. They don't philosophize it away. It is real and it's dangerous. So I'll stop. That's my little presentation this evening. People have comments or questions, a couple of minutes. And my email is dsilber@risha.org. If you want to write me questions or comments, I'm happy to.
Rabbi
Yes.
Silber,
Yes.
I have a question.
Yep.
Is there an inevitability in this narrative, the way it's propelled forward? Is it a
That's an
natural
excellent
order?
question. Hey,
Is
raise
it-
that question next week. I'll deal with it. That's an excellent question.
I just want
My
to ask.
answer is it can be read 2 ways. The short answer is I believe that you're right. That there isn't that one way to read it is the Torah is describing for us the world in which we actually live, which is the world of Noach. But it does so by means of describing a world in which we cannot live. The reader knows when God says you can have all the fruit except that one tree. We know that we're going to eat of that one tree. There's no question. I mean, for sure, right? So the question is it inevitable? That's your question. Is that, or do you read it as a kind of, maybe even a kind of fortunate fall, as some Christians would put it, or is it truly a fall? It's just a sin and fall. I think you can't actually tell. I think both readings are valid. My own personal proclivity is to lean more towards what you're suggesting, that it's inevitable, and a description of the world in which we live by contrasting it with a world in which we cannot live.
My
should not live within.
second point of that was going to be, is this the natural order according to the Torah? The inevitability, but also the natural order of the whole creation, whether the first, the second, is it what we're going to see as what propels the narrative forward?
I'm not sure I understand what you mean by natural order.
Well, that's my question. I mean, there are many different concepts of a natural order. Is good and evil part of again
That's the point of these 4 questions about good and evil. To what extent is the
Right.
nachash alive and well?
Let
me, yes.
Okay.
is it possible that by God creating in chapter 1 the world that is Tov Ma'od, he has set up for us, man, to be Lo Tov because we can't be God? The nachash is really our component that is angry we can't be God, and we can't live forever or be omniscient.
Right. I mean, the question is, right. So it comes down, I think, to, once again, to what extent we read the story as not just about the nachash and banishment, but we read the story, we see ourselves in this nachash. I think that is that's what I really wanted to talk about. So let's hold it off with that. And it's a sort of a fundamental question about, it comes up in many different contexts. It comes up in the Zohar too, about this evil empire. Is the evil empire simply disconnected from the good empire? Or within the good empire, there are already inroads, maybe necessary inroads of the evil empire? We talk about the nachash. The question is, I would add another question. We can raise the question, to what extent some of these qualities of the nachash are necessary in order to live in this world? That's another good question. Let me take 1 or 2 more comments because I do have to stop. Yes, I need more.
What I keep thinking is that nachash leads them to eat of the tree of knowledge.
That's
So
right.
it's not only evil, and that's actually what you're saying. And I also keep thinking of Jacob, who uses deviance and the
Yes,
heel.
sure.
I mean, and he's with the heel
Of course.
to get what he eventually needs to
Okay,
get.
so we'll touch upon Jacob and the nachash, of course, the heel. I mean, the truth is, my Sunday class, I'm actually teaching and studying Jacob as
Well,
well.
that's I'm taking that with you.
Yeah, so you know
That's
that
what
Jacob is
yes.
presented initially as a kind of nachash. He's the right.
Right.
He takes advantage of people's weaknesses, his father's blindness, his brother's being tired. His name is Jacob, as Asaph said.
Yes.
Did he call himself Jacob, or did they name him Jacob?
Yeah.
He circumvented me twice. So
Right.
we will deal with these questions. That's the point of this, is to look in 3 more sessions. We're not going to be able to fully deal with nachash and evil, but I think at least to raise some of the questions and to look at some of the texts is important. And this is, to me, if you had to pick out 1 or 2 foundational texts of the Bible, this is it. I mean, this is the story of the Garden of Eden. What does it mean to be a human being, which is what the story actually is about.
And my point is that
description of creation. What does it mean to be human?
And maybe he's not just evil. And if you think of Carl Jung, that we all have the shadow side, that we need that to be human.
Well, that's the question. Do we actually need that? Is it part of us by default, or is it part of us that it's actually necessary, not just it's there? But okay, these are questions. So
Rabbi,
yes.
The nachash, if you look at his shoresh, nachash is divination. And
Yes,
what the nachash has actually done is set himself up as an alternate deity to God. Because when the nachash says, you won't die if you eat, and they eat and they don't die, they're left with the question of who's the real God? Look, we didn't die. God said we would die, and here we are. We haven't died. So now you have an alternate deity that's let loose in the world, and I think that's really what the nachash symbolizes.
Okay, let me say you raised actually several very important points, which I'll deal with maybe next week or the week after, and that is, you know, the nachash as, I mean, certainly the nachash is represented as God's adversary. There's no question about it. But I will deal with the idea of nichush. I will deal with. Rabbi is a nachash, nichush, right? Lo tinachashu. That will come up, and it will come up also in the context of nachash and nechoshet. But I'll have to stop at this point. And yes, Yonino, you get the last
one really quick thing. I just want to say about them not dying. I mean, how do we know that they don't? How do we know that they weren't supposed to live forever? Nobody has died yet. So this whole concept of that, they don't know at this point.
Right. I mean, that's if you raise the question. I mean, if you raise the question next time, I'll deal with that briefly about do they die? Don't they die? They don't die right away, that's for sure. But what they're supposed to doesn't mean you'll be mortal, as opposed you'll die immediately. That's a good question. I mean, the story of the nachash raises a lot of questions. Okay, we'll stop at this point then. Thank you all. I'm very last minute notice. Thank you to Gitti Bentheim for suggesting this, and it really caught my imagination. So it's a story that I really been thinking about a lot lately, and just the confluence of conversations we had, I decided just to, because my own learning is to do with my teaching, actually. That's what I learned. I learned from the classes. So thank you all. Okay, so we'll continue next time. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Rabbi Silber, for
Thank you.
a wonderful class, as always, and to all of you for joining us here as part of our learning community. In addition to the 3 classes that Rabbi Silber is currently teaching at Jerisha, and the 1 class that Rabbanit Leah Sarna is teaching, this upcoming week, we will have 2 more classes starting, one with Rabbi Dr. Shlomo Zuckier and one with Rabbanit Gila Rosen, both on concepts related to Shemitah. We hope that you join for any that you're interested in. And thank you again for your forbearance with my tech issues. We might see the return of source sheets. Who knows what will happen to resolve whatever's going on. Be well, and we hope to see you soon.
Thank you.
Shabbat shalom.